Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Governance of Global Moon Exploration and Settlement, Episode 4, Best Practice for Sustainable Lunar Activity, the Way Forward. I am Giuseppe Ribaldi, the President of the Moon Village Association. And I'd like to introduce the webinar, which is organized with the support of the Cyprus Space Exploration Organization, with whom we have a strong partnership. In this context, the last time we have been able to reach something like 30,000 people, and hope we will have the same today or even more. So I would like to say a few words about, first, about the Moon Village Association. It is a non-governmental organization registered in Vienna in November of 2017, created to foster the implementation of the Moon Village intended as a global cooperation. The association is a member of the International Astronautical Federation, as well as an observer in the United Nations COPUOS. The association is a platform, a forum to advance peace and cooperation in the moon exploration and settlement, involving industry, government, space agency, international organization, NGO, and most important as well, the public. It is also a catalyst to stimulate a virtuous cycle of investment for the development of the lunar ecosphere. So the association presently has individual as well as institutional members, like university or industry. We count presently about 45 countries, as well as representative from 22 institutional members. So let me explain to you why the association created the best practice, which is the topic of today's discussion. The association being very concerned about promoting the advance of peace and cooperation in the moon exploration and settlement, realized that there are going to be a number of increasing, let's say, countries which are participating to this endeavor, and it's clearly that some of these missions, which are starting to be launched as early as November, with the Chang'e 5 mission, will increase the rate in the next few years, and many of those missions will aim to the similar area, which is the South Pole. So in view of that, and because we do not have a common level playing field for those missions, although we have, of course, all the relevant international treaty, which everyone is respecting, but they are very general and they could be also misinterpreted. We felt that the creation of this practice will basically use for three main reasons. The first reason is to de-risk those missions by having an increased confidence level, by knowing how each actor will behave by launching a mission to the moon. So this will create confidence building between different actors in a period of say, complex international political landscape. The second element is that we would like for the moon exploration to be more conscious of the environment. And in order to do that, in our best practice, there are a number of, let's say, elements which are, let's say, responsibilizing industry as well as government in impacting in a very, let's say, mild way, control way, the moon environment, like debris. Third objective of the best practice is to try to foster the involvement of as many countries as possible, particularly developing countries. So for all these three reasons, we created and published the best practice. So the best practice, of course, will be the topic of our discussion. And so let me show you that at this point in time, basically, we have a version which it has been published in March. This version has been elaborated with the comment we have received. We had a period of 6 months where we have received a substantial number of comments. And the feature of the best practice for sustainable lunar activities will be explained in detail later by Professor Mark Sundell. The main feature of those best practices is indeed to establish a common level playing field for future lunar activity, to be not legally binding, as the name indicated, and will evolve as the circumstances and the experience, hopefully, on the field, on the moon, will evolve following a known principle of adaptive governance. So you can see the 13 elements, but it is not my job to explain in detail. It is Mark. Let me now turn to conclude my presentation on what are the different steps that we are undertaking in order to implement basically this strategy. So the element of this strategy is constituted by 2 steps. The first steps is related to the, let's say, having a preliminary agreement which we believe can be fostered via a space agency and at the later stage to industry. So we feel that there is a need, because of the increasing rate of the mission, to try to achieve a common understanding between major stakeholders. And in order to do that, we have launched a number of initiatives, including a roundtable with Space Agency, which was held last week as a part of the end of the consultation. At this roundtable, a number of space agencies from all continents participated, and I am pleased to say that the large majority of the space agency did support the way the MBA is proposing to move forward. So our next step within the step 1 is to address them directly with the official letter, inviting them to support those best practices. And we will announce the status of the support, which we hope is going to be important, at the upcoming first online Moon Village workshop and symposium, which will also be discussed and presented later in detail. So we hope that with the step 1, which reach the first stage with the announcement that we will make it on the 9th of November, we will continue, of course, the discussion in a very incremental way, trying to increase the number of space agency and eventually industry which will support these best practices before we arrive to the step 2. And the step 2 is indeed the step related to involving, sorry that it went back, so related to going to COPOS. That means basically the step 2, which is some reason is not showing up, here it's coming. It is indeed, we all know that COPOS is the ultimate place for multilateral discussion. And so clearly it is our goal to do this discussion within the frame of the COPOS, but as we all know, COPOS discussion for a number of technical reasons take time. So that is the reason we believe the 2-step strategy which the Moon Village Association have, I hope, has the support of everyone and will allow to put in place a preliminary agreement, hopefully in the next month or so, and then in the fullness of time, which might be a few years, we could have a more recognized and multilateral and proper, let's say, agreement following the discussion in the caucus. The step 2 will be discussed more in detail by the UNOSA representative, which I will introduce when it comes to him. So with that, I would like simply now to go and explain the agenda. So the agenda sees as a first speaker, after my introduction, to Professor Mark Sundell, is the director of the Global Space Law Center in Cleveland State University, and he will explain in detail within this time allocated to him the major feature of the best practice. So Mark, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rebaldi. As Giuseppe mentioned, my name is Mark Sundell, and I am a professor of law at Cleveland State University and the director of the Global Space Law Center at the university, which is the only space law center in the United States dedicated exclusively to the study of the law of outer space. And I have the distinct honor of being the chief drafter of the Moon Village best practices. And it was my job as the chief drafter to synthesize and incorporate all of the many good comments that we received. And many of you who are listening submitted your comments, and you will see that you had an effect on this next version of the best practices that we are unveiling today. So I want to thank you very much for your efforts. They were appreciated. I did not do all of the work alone. I must also recognize my members of the Student Research Council here at the Global Space Law Center, Christine Sivone, Amy Fanter, Jeff Murphy, Haley Kepchar, and last but not least, Haley Hilsman. So they have been very valuable assistants to my work. Well, now I'm going to share my screen and share with you the best practices. Here we are. Now we have a total of 13 best practices, and it begins with the objectives to lay out exactly what it is we are trying to achieve, which is to implement this Moon Village concept of settling the moon, which is a vision of peaceful global cooperation in lunar exploration and utilization. It is a call for all members of the international community, both public and private, including the general public, to join together and cooperate, contribute what each of us can to create a new era of human settlement on the moon. And that's made clear in these objectives. Also, the fact that they're not legally binding is important to notice, and that was one of the changes that was made to this early portion of the best practices, is to change the recitals, which stated the objectives, into this more I guess, pedestrian statement of our objectives, because the recitals took the appearance, I think, almost of a treaty, and we wanted to avoid any appearance of a treaty or a binding instrument. These are not. And we go from there to, of course, international law, which is the backdrop against which all of our efforts operate. And we require that, or we encourage, not require, but encourage all space actors to act in compliance with international law, of course, and in particular, but not excluding other treaties, the Outer Space Treaty, or the Magna Carta of space law. The sharing of benefits is one of the fundamental cornerstones of existing space law, but it is vague. It is a vague obligation of space actors, of states, to share benefits. And it's not clear exactly what form that should take. And so we endeavored, with the help of everyone who submitted comments, to try to add some shape, give some form to this obligation of sharing benefits. And we do that here in Best Practice 3. After asking that space actors pay particular attention to the needs of developing countries and countries with incipient space programs, we encourage the development of space science and technology, cooperation in education and training, access to and the exchange of information, and finally, cooperative ventures. And those cooperative ventures should include cooperative ventures between public and private entities. And of course, these benefits should be made without discrimination and on terms mutually agreeable by all. Now, these are not the only types of benefits that may be shared, but I think we've made progress in putting some meat on this bone. Let's move on to governance. This best practice states that we should, as an international community, develop a system of governance that will facilitate the peaceful settlement of the moon and lunar activity. And that will be done gradually, of course. These are the first careful steps in the process. And so it is important to understand one of the fundamental principles of the best practices is this idea of incremental governance, that the rules will evolve as the activity evolves and as we can actually see what type of rules we'll need. But we do not start with a clean slate, with a blank slate. We start with the existing treaties of international space law as well as general international law. And here we have selected and only reproduced existing obligations and principles of international law. We did not reproduce all of them, although all of them are, of course, in effect. But what the purpose of these, or the approach of the best practices has been to focus on those issues and those principles that are going to be of particular importance, so we can focus our mind on those principles of particular importance and begin to think about how they might be implemented in actual practice. And what are those principles? They'll be familiar to all students of space law. The use of space exclusively for peaceful purposes, freedom of exploration, free access to all areas of the moon, and freedom of scientific investigation, cooperation and mutual assistance, and perhaps the most important, if I were to choose one, the obligation to operate with due regard to the corresponding interests of all other parties, so that we can coexist and not interfere with one another. That we shall offer assistance in events of distress, as set forth in the Rescue and Return Agreement. That harmful interference should be avoided, and if harmful interference is possible, then consultation should be undertaken. That states bear international responsibility for the activities of their nationals and should properly authorize and continually supervise those activities so that they are in compliance with international laws and standards. Avoiding harm is the principal objective, as well as to avoid conflict. And so we encourage space actors to avoid causing adverse changes to the environment of the moon, to mitigate to the degree possible the creation of orbital debris, to avoid causing harmful interference with existing lunar activities, and finally, to avoid causing adverse changes to internationally endorsed sites of significant scientific or historical interest, such as the early landing sites on the moon. Long-term sustainability is in the title of these best practices, the best practices for the sustainability of lunar activities. And so we must recognize that the United Nations has already done a significant amount of work in finalizing the United Nations guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. But we put a finer point on that reference by mentioning that capacity building, which is an aspect of sustainability, the education of future generations to sustain the continued activity on the moon and other places in space, that capacity building should particularly be directed to the youth and to women who are in many areas not equally represented in the space industry. Private activity is one of the big differences between the early space age and the modern space age. And now we are shifting to private activity. and we've seen an incredibly robust expansion of that activity. And this best practice clarifies that all types of private activity, not only private activity in conjunction with government activity or private activity that is merely scientific, will be permitted and encouraged, but even purely commercial private activity, such as space tourism, resource extraction, as well as non-commercial private activity as well, such as basic science experiments carried out by private entities and human habitation, human settlements. And then particular encouragement is asked for public-private partnerships, which has been so successful in boosting the creation of the private space industry in partnership with NASA, ESA, other space agencies. And so those have proven to be successful, and we encourage them. Space resources, one of the most controversial issues, and a topic which is being taken up now by the United Nations. We address it here and encourage that it be conducted of course, in compliance with international law and with Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which bans national appropriation of celestial bodies. But we state here that there's an understanding that, inherently speaking, resource extraction does not constitute national appropriation of celestial bodies. We also ask that space actors support the development of other initiatives, both hard and soft law, that will help develop certain aspects of resource mining that are of particular importance, such as safety standards, priority rights, and non-interference with existing mining activities. And of course, one of the leading, if not the leading, I think I can safely say the leading initiative on developing these principles of resource extraction are the building blocks that were developed by the Hague International Working Group on the Governance of Space Resource Activity, which has been submitted to the UN to be considered as we exchange views on resource activities in our upcoming or next meeting, whenever that might be. There is more of a future-looking, a forward-looking recommendation or consideration that in the future it may become beneficial to create a process to limit space resource activity as to location and duration in order to ensure equitable, responsible use of limited resources. But to create the system and bureaucracy for that now would be too soon. Registration is most important, another most important aspect. And it ties in with due regard, which I called out earlier as perhaps the most important legal principle. But you can only operate with due regard with respect to someone else's interests if you know what those interests are, if you know what their activities are. And so there needs to be a sharing of information of activities on the moon and in cislunar space. And the way to do that at this point is to make use of the existing UN registry under the Registration Convention. But we do ask or encourage or suggest that in order to really enhance the ability of actors to operate with due regard and avoid harmful interference, that registrations contain information about the location of the space objects that are going to be on the moon, the nature of the activity, and the duration of the activity. I think only with that information does the international community have enough information to properly exercise these obligations to operate with due regard and to avoid interference. In time, again, this is a forward-looking concept, a dedicated registry for lunar activities should be considered. The existing UN registry is not intended for lunar activity, and it's obvious in its design, which calls for orbital parameters and is clearly designed for orbital space, orbital activity. Sharing of information, as you probably noted already, it's appeared already a couple of times, the importance of sharing information. But here we make a general statement that it's critical to facilitate international cooperation and not only do we then call and encourage for the sharing of information, but we encourage the creation of a method for sharing such information, a centralized method, a centralized database, where scientific information can be organized and shared, and also other best practices of all types. And there is a limit, of course, to what information can be shared, and that's recognized in this closing statement, that there's a limit pursuant to export controls that protect against the sharing of military data or technology that can be used for military purposes, proprietary intellectual property, and information that may impinge upon national security. So there are limits, but we do encourage broad sharing of information. There will be many initiatives and many efforts, both domestic and international and regional, to begin to develop the law. And we encourage all space actors to be engaged in those initiatives. And they will take the form of both hard treaty law and also soft law, as these best practices are. And so we encourage to support these initiatives because there are many issues to address, such as interoperability, so that we can all plug in and play with each other, work with each other on the moon. Engineering standards, safety practices, finance. We can't forget that it's extremely expensive to undertake these ventures. We need to make funds available. And finally, environmental protection needs to be considered as we move forward on our lovely moon. Dispute resolution. Disputes will inevitably arise. Human nature will not be checked at the border of our atmosphere. But when disputes do arise, we encourage peaceful resolution, of course, and if possible, consultation, formal and informal, to try to resolve these disputes at the lowest level. And then, if necessary, consider alternative dispute resolutions such as mediation and arbitration. Finally, best practice 13 is to continue the process, the ever-evolving process of developing the best practices. They are not static. This is a new version, but it will be a changing version. It will be the official version for only so long. And so we ask everyone to be engaged in continuing to review and develop these best practices for the best of all mankind. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions when the time comes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mark. This was very good and very timely. So I would like now to move to our next speaker, which is Dr. Niklas Hedman. He is the Chief Committee Policy and Legal Affairs Section of the Office of Outer Space Affairs of the United Nations Office in Vienna. So, Niklas, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. I will now share my screen. So, space governance and COPUS. I think this is appropriate for this particular webinar, since we are discussing how the Moon Village Association, as a permanent observer to the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, can move on and interact into the official considerations under the agenda item on space resources in the legal subcommittee. I would like to step back to the glorious year of 2019. Unfortunately, 2020 saw disruptions in the work of the committee and its subcommittees. This year, we held a successful session of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee in February. Then we went into a lockdown, and consequently, the 59th session of the Legal Subcommittee and the 63rd session of COPUS had to be cancelled. But last year was successful in the sense that COPUS adopted, after 10 years, more or less 10 years work, adopted its guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. And that was a major achievement of this intergovernmental body. COPUS also made advances under its bold work, if I put it that way, on developing a Space 2030 agenda and implementation plan. So this work was also moving forward. And COPUS finally, together with its two subcommittees, were also discussing in very concrete terms how to foster its internal governance and method of work. And that was something that also moved ahead last year. If we look back and look at COPUS as an intergovernmental body, a political body with treaty-making powers under the General Assembly. You all probably know that the committee was founded as an ad hoc body already in 1958. And in 1959, and you see the resolution mentioned down there, 1959, this body received its permanent status under the General Assembly. COPUS started off with 18 states members, and as of today, we have 95. We also have 42 permanent observer organizations, both international intergovernmental organizations and international non-governmental organizations. In the IGO pool, we can see, of course, the European Space Agency and the Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization. And in the NGO pool, obviously, and as appropriate now, we have the Moon Village Association, which was granted observer status last year, 2019. As I've already alluded to, the committee operates with two subcommittees, scientific and technical, and the legal subcommittee. Now, going back to the treaty-making power of this political intergovernmental body under the General Assembly, as we know, this body has created the legal regime of outer space. The 5 treaties, United Nations treaties on outer space, the sets of principles, and I also list here other residual instruments that are non-legally binding. The principles are, per definition, also non-legally binding. But here we have the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines of the Committee, adopted in 2007, the Safety Framework for Nuclear Power Sources from 2009, and lately, the Guidelines for the Long-Term Sustainability, which were adopted in 2019. And for those who are interested, the guidelines on LTS are contained in the COPUS report from 2019 in all languages of the United Nations, and you can find documentation and reports on the website of the Office for Outer Space Affairs. In addition, the committee, and I would say in particular its legal subcommittee, have developed also a set of General Assembly resolutions. And as we all know, they are not legally binding, they are politically binding. But nevertheless, this series of resolutions dealing with the concept of the launching state, registration practice, national space legislation are important because they all attempt and actually succeed in arriving at a common denominator for interpreting certain critical requirements under the respective treaties. There has also been a working group working for some years on the study of international frameworks and how states are performing bilateral and multilateral activities outside of the global level, which is represented by COPUS. If we look at the complement of states members of the committee, what is interesting here is that it's a very diverse community. So we have major spacefaring nations, we have space nations that are not performing major programs, but nevertheless are highly qualified in science and technology. We have emerging space nations, and we also have quite many countries that are predominantly space-using countries and not spacefaring countries. So you will see this interesting mix of developing countries and of industrialized nations in this committee. And that is one of the really interesting points about the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, that it has this variety and the broadness, holistic, I would say, complement of the world within its ranks. COPUS works by consensus, and this is very important to note. It has done that since the very early 60s, so all decision makings are taken by consensus. COPUS and its subcommittees do not operate with voting, as contrary to the General Assembly. So consensus is the decision-making rule of this body. And there, of course, consensus means that everybody has to be on board in decision-making. And obviously, if there is a political consensus, then it takes shorter time. If there is a lack of consensus at the political level, then it takes longer time. And that is natural in all intergovernmental processes. There is very often, I hear the comment that COPUS is a slow body, that the decision-making of the committee and its subcommittees is slow. And I disagree totally. Of course, there might be several years taken to really arrive at politically difficult solutions, like in the long-term sustainability guidelines. But where else would such political consensus be achieved in a shorter time frame involving all the major spacefaring nations? And that is a question I put forward, because COPUS reflects the political situation, the geopolitical situation in the world. The mandate of COPUS is very general, and it was put in print in 1959 by the founding resolution of this body. And this is the mandate we're working after. Yes, indeed. This is the mandate of COPUS. And what you can see immediately is that how general, but also how open it is. How open it is for this body to catch up and work jointly with all its states members in today's realities of space activities. If we look at the agenda of the committee and its two subcommittees, we see that it is broad and it is diverse. There are items dealing with how we use space science and technology applications for the betterment of planet Earth and for sustainable development considerations, obviously. There are also items dealing with the way we operate in orbit, so the safety of space operations and what are the hazards and threats to space operations in orbit. We also have items in particular in the legal subcommittee dealing with a full range of legal materia surrounding space activities. And of course, it's through the legal subcommittee that the 5 treaties were formed. But beyond the treaties, I would say there is now an engaging dialogue in the committee on particularly issues relating to future space traffic management, which we know the concept of STM is not defined at the international level. And then obviously we have the item on space resources that I will come to very soon. Finally, space safety, security, and sustainability is something that is also, of course, there underpinning several of those items that you can see, and in particular from the perspective of transparency and confidence building measures in outer space activities. So if we quickly look into what we have at the table now in the legal subcommittee, in 2017, an agenda item, and the item is titled General Exchange of Views on Potential Legal Models for Activities in Exploration, Exploitation, and Utilization of Space Resources. So 2017, we got this item on the agenda as a single issue item for discussion. And this is, of course, internal decision-making on how the method of work is being performed in the body. But I can inform you that this is an item that is only has a mandate for 1 single year, and then it has to be renewed. So it's not a permanent item, and it's not an item under a working group. It is an item in plenary which only has a 1-year mandate, and it is then annually being extended. LSC next year, in 2021, which will be the 60th session of the legal subcommittee, will continue, of course, where we had to stop, if I may say so, last year, because 2020 has been a year without any progress as far as the intergovernmental level is concerned. So next year, the so-called scheduled informal consultations on this particular agenda item will take place in plenary during the legal subcommittee. It was planned to do it this year, but now we have to do it the next year. Those scheduled informal consultations are to be co-moderated by Stephen Freeland, our moderator today, Stephen, and together with Andrzej Misztal of Poland. So Andrzej and Stephen will lead those discussions in the upcoming session of the legal subcommittee. Hopefully it can be held as planned in April 2021. Now we come to an important point here. The discussions in the legal subcommittee on space resources are so far in plenary. There has been no specific documentation put on the table for stimulating a constructive dialogue among states members of the committee. We have received this year a working paper by the Netherlands and Luxembourg submitting the building blocks that stems from the Hague Working Group on Space Resource Governance. So the building blocks are there on the table in a document that is available in all the 6 official languages of the United Nations. And this document will provide a basis for discussions in the scheduled informal consultations next year. Now, the question is, what will happen with other initiatives? Obviously, the Artemis Accords that we note were released this week. There is a clause in the Artemis Accords which tells that they should be submitted to the United Nations for dissemination, and they should be provided as a formal document, which basically means that they also would have the status of a document in all languages. And now comes the question, and this is a question to Moon Village Association, to make available the best practices for sustainable lunar activities to the legal subcommittee. Moon Village Association, as a permanent observer to the committee, can do so, but it can only do so in a conference room paper, in an in-session document in English only. So it would probably be of interest for the Moon Village Association to seek support from a state member or a group of state members that could sponsor the best practices to be put on the table of the legal subcommittee in a document that would have the same status as L312 as put forward by Netherlands and Luxembourg. So this is really something that MVA should consider, to put the document before the legal subcommittee in all languages. If we very quickly look at the governance phases of COPUS, we immediately see something interesting, and that is the 20-year mark. I often talk about this, but it actually is something that should be put on the table, because we see clearly that from 60s to the 80s was the era of treaty making. So, of course, the 1963 resolution on legal principles is not a legally binding instrument, but that was the precursor of the Outer Space Treaty that came in 67, and then followed the other 4 more special treaties, the Rescue Agreement, the Liability Convention, Registration Convention, and the Moon Agreement, which was the latest. I don't say the last, I say the latest deliberately, in 1979. That period of treaty making, legally binding treaty making, was followed by a 20-year period of principles making. So there you have the remaining 4 principles: the radio broadcasting, the nuclear power source principles, remote sensing principles, and the benefits declaration. And they are non-legally binding instruments. And further on, 20 to 2020, we had this era of resolutions and guidelines with the latest 2019 LTS guidelines adopted in 2019. So you will see that this intergovernmental body has gone from treaties to legally binding principles and to non-legally binding, politically binding resolutions and guidelines. And obviously the question is, what will we see in the next 20-year mark? And that is the question. If we look at Unispace Plus 50 that was celebrated in 2018, and you maybe all know that we celebrated the holding of the first global conference on the peaceful uses of outer space in 1968, so it was really the 50 years anniversary of that event. Kupus went through, in its preparation for the Unispace Plus 50 event in 2018, worked over some 4 years in really defining its governance projection and how it really, as not only as a body, but also through its states members and observer pool, how it is pursuing those cross-cutting areas. And what is interesting to see here is that space governance is really at the core, but also issues regarding resilience and interoperability. Kupus has been more and more working on interoperability and resiliency over the past years. And I wanted to put that because I note that the Moon Village Association best practices also operate with the terminologies like interoperability, and that is an important task within that instrument. When we look at governance regimes for the future regarding moon activities or also other celestial bodies, but not only that, also when we look into long-term sustainability, what would come next? And remember, I said 2020, we don't know what will follow in the next 20 years. It is important to look into other governance regimes. Obviously, air, sea, frequencies, the deep seabed, in particular when it comes to resource extraction from the moon and other celestial bodies, maybe also the Antarctic Treaty System. And lastly, I would say cyber, although cyber is not really a regime, it's more of a fragmented way of looking into several aspects of cyber security and safety. But nevertheless, cyber is an area that is also increasingly important. And lastly, my final point here is that in fostering space multilateralism, just to give a projection, it probably would be important to be a little bit stringent in the way we deal with the various activities we have at hand. So first of all, we have to consider the planetary environment, and here I mean the moon and other celestial bodies. And obviously exploration, innovation, and as we know, the space resource utilization, but also on environmental and cultural protection. And in this context, of course, when it comes to environmental protection or harmful contamination, we have the planetary protection requirements that are guided by COSPAR via its policy on planetary protection and being performed by the Panel on Planetary Protection. So COSPAR is the international body dealing with planetary protection. The second element is different, is space environment when we talk about the orbits. And there predominantly we have the LTS guidelines, as we know. And as a projection for the safety of space operation and really making that even more important for governments to really take into account, when we go about and develop a more robust way of reporting and exchange and dissemination of information, we will see the fabrics of future space traffic management. And lastly, the Earth environment, or the concerns that are really for Earth and for ground segments. Obviously, space weather, it's also a matter at hazard that is relevant for orbits, but I put space weather here because it really fits within the Earth environment consideration. And here, obviously, one very large area that will becoming increasingly important is the dark and quiet skies. securing astronomical observations in an era where we will see more and more launching of satellites, not least mega constellations. And it all serves to bring order into how we deal with our concerted space activities, whether they are planetary activities, orbital activities, or activities that would have an effect and bearing on planet Earth itself. It is a way of fostering interest of space actors because, as I put it here, there is a different way, there is I would say, conflict of interest. Yes, I can say so, conflict of interest between governance, geopolitical concerns on planetary activities, for instance, commercial aspiration, commercial concerns, and that is then put, of course, contrary to scientific interest and to, in particular, the whole area of scientific investigation of planetary environments of the moon, but I would say more predominantly of Mars and the so-called ocean worlds in the outer solar system. So I just wanted to put this space multilateralism projection before you. I think it will be more and more important to look into all the space activities in a structured manner. And above all, multilateralism is important, and this is what we have to foster through the work of the committee and its two subcommittees. And I, as secretary of those bodies, I look forward to work closely with Stephen Freeland and Andres Mistal in the legal subcommittee under their scheduled informal consultations on space resources. Thank you.
Presentation. So I think we now move to the last speaker before the roundtable discussion take place. So the next speaker is George Danos, which is the CEO of the Cyprus Space Exploration Organization, as well as the chairman of the local organizing committee of the Moon Village next upcoming workshop. So he will give us a sneak preview of this meeting and the relevance for our discussion. So George, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Giuseppe, for the introduction. Let me share my screen. As Giuseppe said, I'm the president of the Cyprus Space Exploration Organization. And I'm here today to alert you that there's a major event coming up in a couple of weeks' time, which is in relation to what we're discussing here today. So make sure you save the date and mark it in your agenda. This is the first global Moon Village workshop and symposium. It's a major event, and it's hosted by CSEO from Nicosia, Cyprus. Cyprus, through its crossroads location and its long history and friendly relations between nations, is the ideal location to gather together in synergy for the next steps in lunar exploration. So now let's have a look at what this event is all about. So I'm gonna share with you the website briefly. So here is the website, and we can see that it's in 24 days time, and we have these people as keynote speakers: Simonetta Di Pippo, Mike Gold, Jan Werner, and many, many others. And if I go specifically to the program, we can see that in relation to what we spoke about today, we have this session, which is going to be the announcement of the support of the space agencies. And in this slot of the symposium, we intend to announce the countries that are supporting the best practices for sustainable lunar activities. Now, what I would like to say is that in the past 5 months, our various events have had over 300,000 viewers. So we expect to have a high attendance for this symposium. And if I go back to my presentation, so I'm asking you not to forget to tune in on the 9th and 10th of November. The registration is free, and you can register, as you can see, at this address here, which is mva2020.cseo.org.cy. We're looking forward to seeing you all at this online workshop and symposium. And with this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you, and back to you, Giuseppe.
Okay, George, thank you. Indeed, I think this is an important event. This is our yearly event, which, as anybody else, is happening online. So that's why it's the first. It's not really the first. It's the fourth event, but it's the first online, and that's how we call it. So without further doing, I will now enter in the last part of our webinar, which is the question and answer. And I am extremely pleased to introduce you the moderator of this part, which is Professor Stephen Freeland. It is Professor of International Law of Western Sydney University in Australia. You heard about him already mentioned by a number of previous speakers. So I think this is an honor for us to have you as a moderator of this question and answer. So Stephen, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Giuseppe. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. And for me, it's late in the, well, it's early in the morning. It's just before 1 o'clock in the morning here in Australia. I welcome you. I thank the Moon Village Association again for the very kind invitation to participate. And thank you very much to you, Giuseppe, Mark, Nicholas and George for enlightening the audience about these various issues. Clearly, the last few weeks have been fairly momentous for space in many ways. In fact, every week is almost momentous for space now. We hear great announcements. Last week, of course, was World Space Week, and there were many, many events. This week, we've had a number of events, both potentially great, but also potentially disastrous. And we're all delighted that it seems the potential for a collision between two pieces of space debris has not eventuated. But it very much focuses our minds on the challenges of space. And of course, I note in the best practices that when Mark went through, there was reference to the need to ensure that we mitigate in the best possible way space debris, and both Nicholas and Mark have also made reference to the sustainability guidelines, which are also important in that regard. The Moon Village Association hosted, as Giuseppe said, a round table earlier this week. I had the pleasure of also moderating that. And we had representatives from quite a number of the space agencies from around the world, from larger spacefaring nations and intergovernmental agencies to perhaps less significant space players, but people who are countries that are interested in engaging in lunar activities at some stage, or at least interested in engaging in the discussions. And that was very fruitful. And out of that, the Moon Village Association, as Mark said, have taken on board not only the comments that came from the public, but also from those agencies. And as Mark said, these best practices are an evolving thing. So there are many things happening in space. Of course, Nicholas also mentioned of great relevance a couple of other inputs that may come to the multilateral process that will be at COPOS, one being the reference to the work of the building blocks of the Hague Working Group on International Governance. And then, as we all know, just a couple of days ago, the publication of the more detailed so-called Artemis Accords. We already had the principles, we now have the Accords, and obviously they cover some similar areas to the best practices. So this is a topic and an area that is at the forefront of discussions. It's tied in with many other things, and the Moon Village Association and other groups working on it must be congratulated for focusing everybody's attention on the important challenges. So what I'd like to do, we have about 25 to 30 minutes, is just raise a few questions. I note also there are a couple of questions in the Q&A which I will refer to the speakers. But let me start for Mark, Nicholas, and George, in particular, the three of you. What do you see the biggest challenges are in terms of achieving the goals that the Moon Village Association has in these best practices? That is, cooperation in a sustainable way, maintaining, as Nicholas said, the safety, security, and sustainability of space in a way that will allow for activities off Earth, if you like, to be conducted in a peaceful and non-conflicting way. How do we de-risk that conflict? What do you see, each of you, as the biggest challenge to the goals of the best practices? Perhaps, Mark, I should start with you. What's the biggest challenge?
Well, like many lawyers will understand, sometimes your clients refuse to undertake certain preventative cautionary measures until something terrible happens to them. And I think we need an appreciation by the international community that we do need ground rules, that we do need to put in place some precautionary measures before we begin this new era of lunar exploration, settlement, resource extraction. Let's not wait until there is a dispute, until there is conflict and interference. Let's provide now for it. And I think to raise that awareness and to generate that sense of urgency is one of our greatest challenges.
Thank you, Mark. Nicholas, from the, obviously you do not and cannot speak for any of member states, but as you see it, and you've seen many things happen in COPOS over the years, what do you see as the biggest challenge here to achieving that multilateral cooperative approach?
Well, I was thinking now when you asked the question on the challenges and how to step forward, I see the most challenging issue here is probably to really get it to the multilateral approach, to really get all of these efforts being taken already by a number of states members, by governments of states members, to get them into the multilateral intergovernmental context and to really see what can we together do in terms of outlining a path forward, a governance regime. The Artemis Accords is obviously, it's not legally binding, but I mean, it's politically binding among the states that are signatories to it. But I think it would be important to get those states interested in discussing those matters also at the intergovernmental level. I think this is one of the challenges, to really uphold multilateralism in this area.
Thank you. George, I can't see you on my, you're still there, George?
I think there is a problem with internet. I was notified.
Oh.
So,
okay. Well, let's move on. And when George comes back, I'll bring him into the discussion. Mark, you made the point in your summary about the need to encourage private enterprise, entrepreneurship, innovation, commercial enterprises, both, if you like, profitable, quote, so to speak, and non-profitable, although they're not the words in the best practices. How's the best way that that those activities will be regulated so as to avoid perhaps the notion that we might have a fragmentation, different standards applied to different entities depending on where their jurisdiction is? Often you hear the argument from industry in every country, and I've heard it many times, that saying to government, if you don't make it easier for us, we'll just move our organization to another jurisdiction. So how will we ensure that the regulation of private entities is standardized such that everybody is in compliance? Because of course, private enterprise has other goals that, as Nicholas quite rightly said in his presentation, may give rise to perceptions of conflict of interest. So Mark, how do you think the best practices address that, and how should they?
I wish I had the answer to that, Stephen. Then we could all go home. Or at least I do have an answer, that we could avoid inconsistency of rules and regulations and standards of behavior internationally if we had a binding international agreement that was detailed and adopted by all countries around the world and then properly implemented through their domestic legislation. But we all know that that is somewhat of a pipe dream, difficult to achieve, maybe at some point, but it will take a long time. And the challenge, and why this is such a difficult undertaking, is what do we do in the meantime? What are our other options? And I think, to be realistic, while there are multilateral discussions that go forward, we will likely see an evolution of domestic laws. And the challenge then is to try to make sure that those domestic laws are somehow consistent or follow the same principles. And there is, I think, where the best practices can be helpful to try to provide a platform for discussion and agreement about how best to move forward.
And indeed, of course, you talk about implementation in the best practices. The implementation part of the equation is, of course, a really important issue to achieve what you're saying. Thank you. Nicholas, you mentioned that the agenda item at COPOS is about the, I know this phrase very well myself, the exploration, exploitation and utilization of space resources. You would agree, and I think everybody watching would agree, that the Moon Village Association resources is only one part of the broader best practices. Is it possible, appropriate, that this broader discussion fits in to the agenda item, or will it indeed, do you envisage that the agenda item itself might need to be expanded to take into account these broader things as well as resources? Or do you feel that it's all connected anyway?
Yeah, good question, Stephen. And as you observed correctly, it is broader, obviously. The instruments we see on the table already are broader than the item indicates. Although I think that everyone is focused on this debate to be under that item, you see. So in one way or the other, it will be there. But we also have, don't forget that we also have in the legal subcommittee the item on the status and application of the treaties, where we have questionnaires and where we have a constant dialogue on space activities and how states implement their obligations and rights under the treaties. So I would say that there are also possibilities to discuss certain aspects of this also in that context. But I would say everyone is now engaged, I would say, to debate this, and that would be under this particular agenda item on space resources.
Thanks, Nicholas. Welcome back, George. I know this is the plague that we all have to suffer under with online. So welcome back. George, I'd asked both Nicholas and Mark, and I'd like to ask you the same question. What do you think, George, will be the biggest challenge to achieving the noble, laudable, and absolutely appropriate goals of the best practices? What do you think the biggest challenge to actually achieving that in reality might be?
I would say that other than the space agencies, that by the looks of the great work that was done by the Moon Village Association, we have the space agencies on board, but then the next step is to bring on board the industry and to make sure that the industry does adhere by those goals that are set by the space agencies, and they do play ball. Because there might be an industry that decides that this is not relevant to them, or they might actually go and base themselves on a remote location in a country that isn't compliant to the rules and regulations of the United Nations and do whatever they please. So basically, it's very important to make sure that the industry does comply too. And that's why the Moon Village Association, other than engaging the agencies, is also engaging the industry, which is a very important partner in the next steps of lunar exploration.
Great, thank you, George. And I'd like to take that theme for both Mark and Nicholas then. So first, Mark, there are people in the general public who are watching this either directly or through Facebook, and obviously industry partners. And you said that in your remarks, we want everybody to be involved. So how best, given that this is an evolving process, given that the ultimate step 2 that Giuseppe said is to get it into the multilateral process, which is a process amongst states, how can and should the public and industry best be involved now with the Moon Village Association as you move your own plans forward?
Well, I think my first response to that would be to join the Moon Village Association and really become an active participant. You can join the committee that is charged with developing the best practices. So, and that is open to the general public. So I encourage everyone to join the Moon Village Association and be directly involved. But apart from that, to just keep in mind that the Moon Village Association best practices are a product that is on the table that highlights issues that should be discussed. And so they should be considered when lunar activities are being discussed with respect to policy and legal issues.
Great, thanks, Mark. And Nicholas, if I could turn to you, and there's a question from my dear friend Antonino in the Q&A, and I'll refer to that because it's pertinent to the point that George made and Mark responded to. Essentially, the question starts with the premise that perhaps it's time for the COPOS to expand, if you like, the nature of those who are observers or have some form of membership or whatever the right term is, a bit like the ITU, to engage industry more directly and perhaps more formally, such that that may give rise to a broader and perhaps more inclusive discussion. That's the premise of the question. What's your views on that, Nicholas?
Yeah, I have been actually looking at the question from Antonio here, so I'm well prepared. My first point is, of course, goes to the history of COPUS. It is a political intergovernmental body under the General Assembly, and as we all know, private sector entities do not have a seat at the table. And this is just what it is. These are the rules of the road in diplomacy throughout the UN system. What is interesting with ITU is that, and also of course ICAO, but it's a different nature there in ICAO, but ITU with its sector membership, where they actually have present at the sessions, even the World Radio Communication Conferences, they have the private telecom industry sitting there. Obviously, they have no right to take part in decision making because that is only for governments of states members. But they are in the room, they are in the premises, meaning that they have the opportunity to discuss and liaise with other partners and to foster a dialogue between government representatives and private sector, and I would say with non-governmental and intergovernmental organizations. So I'm really looking with some interest in how COPUS in the future, I wouldn't say this will happen overnight. No, we are not there, definitely not. It will take years, but I do hope that space, as telecom was once upon a time, that space technology and the way we set governance in space activities would really deserve to also have the main actors in the room, present. There is a way that delegations, of course, can bring private sector persons into their delegation that are representing industry and other private entities via their delegation. So that is the way just to make it possible for them to be in the room. But COPUS is a political body on the under the General Assembly, and therefore we have those very, very strong regulations since 60 years back.
Thanks, Nicholas. And if I could just add, the important thing about getting things to this multilateral process is you still want to hear all of the voices. And in a sense, the way that the COPOS works, unless I'm incorrect, Nicholas, is those voices can and should be funneled through the relevant delegation.
Yeah.
So we're hoping that when states come to the table, and this is one of the methodologies by which the Moon Village Association best practices, as you said, may be brought to that stage too, Giuseppe, is through a state. We're hoping that states will, in making their own statements and submissions and suggestions on these broad topics, actually already have listened to their own industry and reflect that in their statements. And I've got no reason to doubt that's not the case. I'm sure industry is speaking into the relevant countries and giving their own views, and the countries will assimilate that. Thank you for that. There's a question in here about this workshop is not to focus particularly on the Artemis Accords, because we could talk forever. But Dallas asked is there anything striking that is perhaps a point of distinction between the Moon Village Association best practices and the Artemis Accords? We've all just had 1 or 2 days, of course, to read the Artemis Accords in detail. But does any of the panelists, and Giuseppe, I also throw the floor open to you if you would like to contribute, see something that maybe makes us think, well, perhaps we're not looking at exactly the same sort of thinking? Mark, I think you'd like to raise your hand. Yes.
Yes, there is one clear element in the Artemis Accords, which are, by and large, I can say they're consistent, absolutely consistent with the Moon Village Association best practices. There are no conflicts. But one item that is included in the Artemis Accords, it's not in best practices, is the idea of a unilaterally declared safety zone, which I think has been misconstrued unfairly by some commentators as a keep out zone, as an exclusionary zone that a state will be able to establish unilaterally, and that's not the intention of the safety zone. It's to be purely informational, which is something that the best practices also promote. We want to share the information to ensure not only that the ongoing activities are not interfered with, but also to ensure the safety of other actors. And the Artemis Accords approach that by calling for a safety zone to be established. But again, that doesn't mean it's an exclusionary zone.
Oh, interesting. Thank you. Nicholas, George, or Giuseppe, is there anything that really struck you when you were reading the Artemis Accords that is markedly different from the best practices that we have?
Can I speak?
Yes, Giuseppe, please. Yes.
Okay, maybe. Well, I mean, rather than comparing the two, because of course they are different in nature, I would like simply to indicate the different nature, just for the good order. The Artemis Accord is basically an implementation agreement between the United States and its allies in implementing the Artemis program. As in other times we were calling intergovernmental agreement at the time of the International Space Station. So clearly the Artemis Accord is aimed to the US allies. And therefore there is probably a generic part, which is what we have seen published this week. And then there is an implementation specific part, depending which contribution each country will provide to the Artemis program. So that is, let's say, a necessary tool to, let's say, run a program, let's say, which is even larger than the International Space Station. The best practices are meant from the root to be applicable to all countries of the world because they are not a mechanism of implementing a program like the Artemis. The best practice are aiming to try to define common level playing fields for all the country. And as introduced when I presented the best practices, this is the major, let's say difference, if you like. One, it's an implementation agreement. The other one, without any contradiction, because of course Mark is more, let's say, qualified than me from the legal standpoint, but I don't think there is absolutely neither contradiction. They are completely complementary in terms of a number of, let's say, elements for the implementation, but the goal is different. And that's why we feel it's so important, because the last point I want to make, the Artemis Accord, when we talk about our goal is to try to de-risk the future lunar mission, it is understood that with the US allies, the risk of a possible incident is extremely low by definition, because they are in the same program, right? So where the risk is when you are not in the same program, and therefore you might construe some action in a different way, and therefore act, maybe not on purpose, by creating some possible risk area. And this is where the major added value of this, let's say, initiative is, to try really to de-risk and all the other things you discussed earlier. Thank you.
Thanks, Giuseppe. Unfortunately, Nicholas had to leave us, but it was great to have him. And he really helped us with his clarifications. One issue I wanted to raise, though, from the best practices is, Mark, you emphasized the sharing of benefits as being an important principle for you. People who have studied the history of space law, some would say that that is a more contentious issue, given history, not only with the Moon Agreement, but also in the Law of the Sea Convention. There is provisions in both of those for exploitation of resources in sustainable ways, but with an equitable sharing of benefits, undefined. So I just wonder how the Moon Village Association feels, given the political contentiousness of perhaps that concept, notwithstanding that it's a noble cause, of course. How do you think those historical pieces of baggage might be overcome, and people will accept that sharing of benefits is the way forward? Perhaps Mark and George, you could respond.
Yes, thank you, Stephen, for that question. It is impenetrable in some ways. It's very challenging. We've really tried to do our best to give some color to this concept of sharing of benefits. And it certainly is contentious. There are, on one side of the spectrum, those who believe in the absolute sharing of revenue or materials that would be harvested from a celestial body. And then there are others on the other side of the spectrum who might even say that there's no real obligation that arises out of the text of the Outer Space Treaty, that it is more descriptive of the nature, the inherent nature of outer space activity. So we need to find a middle point somehow, and we did receive many suggestions and comments about this issue during the public consultation period. And I think that we can kind of set up certain goalposts or limitations on this spectrum. I think that there is an obligation, and I think it's an obligation that benefits all, even those who are the ones sharing the benefits. There are benefits that will be received back. There are great, in particular, I think, there's great security, and there are solutions to many problems that will be provided by the sharing of benefits and cooperation, in particular, shared infrastructure, for example. But there are limits to it as well. I think most people can agree that the sharing of revenues would make it impossible for private industry to survive. The business model must be sustainable. On the other hand, businesses are taxed every day and revenues are shared. And so striking the right balance will be the challenge.
Absolutely, I agree. George, Cyprus is an ambitious, but we would all agree not a major yet space spacefaring nation. What do you think Cyprus would expect by way of benefits from activities, and how is that reflected in the best practice?
I would say the position of Cyprus, with a history of how many thousands of years, is a history that indicated friendship, commerce, cooperation. And that's exactly the aspect that I want to highlight in your previous question as to, are we going to get it right? What's the interest in the commercial partners and into all the nations in getting this right? As we see with the climate change, the environment, the destruction of the environment, the scarcity of resources, the growth of the population of humanity, this is not an option. This is a mandatory step forward that we all have to work together, because if we don't, then we're going to have major problems, and the cost of correcting the problems is going to be way, way bigger than getting it right from the get-go. So therefore, cooperation, I believe, is one-way street. So all the nations have to work together. And just like Mark said, there is taxation to the businesses, which is an ordinary thing that happens. So likewise, we all have to understand that this is not just about making money, but at some point, it would be a matter of survival of our species where we are, because the resources we're going to be bringing from the moon and or asteroids or other bodies are going to be crucial in being able to sustain our life here on this planet.
Thank you, wonderful words. And I see that our time is, we could discuss this for a lot longer, but Giuseppe runs a tight ship, I know, time-wise. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, George, for your really insightful comments, and thank you to Nicholas, who had to leave us. And let me again say there will be many discussions, and I, as Nicholas very kindly said, have the honor of co-chairing the multilateral process that inevitably will consider very closely, I think, the best practices and a lot of other inputs. And I hope fora like this, George, like the workshop that you talked about, will continue to stimulate discussion. We need to hear all of the voices. This is an excellent forum to do it, and I congratulate all the organisers of this and your forthcoming workshop. I shall say my farewells to everybody. I'll stay on until Giuseppe closes, but it is now 1:25, so soon I will be going to bed, but I wish you all well, stay safe. Thank you again to the Moon Village Association and my dear friends Giuseppe and Mark for really allowing me to witness and listen to all of your wisdom. And you too, George, it's a pleasure to meet you. I will hand back to Giuseppe and I'll say thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Stephen, and of course, thank you even more because it's nearly 1:30 in the morning in your place. So hopefully we are going to you're going to go to sleep and not having nightmares of this positive, I would say, discussion. So let me first make a couple of observations, and then of course I will come to the conclusion. So first of all, in terms of what has been said, I like to say that our aim, as it has been indicated by Nicholas, is indeed what he has suggested, which is basically to stimulate support of some of the countries of which space agency hopefully they will support. And so I think this is the way forward for us. We are aiming to have a few countries, a group of countries supporting basically the best practice so that it could become basically an official document translated with a different language. So this obviously is our preferred option. I would like to caution some of the speakers which said that we have already the support of the space agency. We had a constructive discussion. Now, from having a constructive discussion to receive a clear support, the step is, I mean, having worked 35 years at the European Space Agency, I know a little bit about the internal mechanism, so I am extremely prudent. So I think we have put in place all what we could do. Now we have to wait and see. And so I think, and then the final remark before drawing to the conclusion, has been discussed a lot about the developing country and industry. Well, I think the MVA, it is a sort of incubator for a number of activities, which we hope then will be spillover also to the UN COPUS. So we are involving developing country. We are having a number of capacity building initiatives together with UNOSA. So we're doing a lot in this area. We will do a lot on area of industry. So we try to prepare, let's say, the rest of the world, so to speak, for support on a broader base, because that's the only way to go forward. So having said that, I now come to the conclusion. So first of all, again, I'd like to thank, obviously, the speaker, which have made a great job. Everybody kept the time. So the participants, which have followed us either by Zoom, either Facebook. Of course, CSEO, for basically utilizing their own technical skill. Glafki Antoniou, which is our management support, which have organized all these webinars. So I like simply to close by simply reminding you that we all now looking forward. We have done all what we could. We are going to bring, so to speak, the ball towards the key space agency. So obviously we can just wait and see what, let's say, the outcome will be. So I hope that we could announce on the 9th of November, when we have this slot, as has been explained, of making an answer, which we could announce the world that we have at least a common level playing field for the future lunar mission, supported by initial group of space agency. This will be certainly a very positive and constructive, let's say, message to be given to young people, but to all the world. So I'm looking forward to hear that. And so with that, I'd like to close. We are basically in time. Again, thank you to everyone, and stay tuned with what's going to come at our workshop. So I hope that all of you will tune in. It's a free workshop. We have just seen the IC just concluded with 13,000 participants. I'm pretty sure that George and all his technical skill will allow us to go well beyond this number in the reaching of the workshop. And so with that, thank you to everyone and to the participant, and I wish you a nice good night to Stephen and to other people, and to all of you, thank you, and stay tuned for the workshop 9 and 10 of November 2020. Thank you, and good day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.